Wealthy CEO shocked to find his mother's twin chained in his guest basement. Chapter 1. The notification came at 2:47 in the morning. Marcus Aldridge did not typically check his phone at 2:47 in the morning. He was a man of rigorous habits, asleep by 11, awake at 5:30, 30 minutes of silence before the day's first email. He had built Aldridge Capital from a single-room office above a dry cleaner's into a $14 billion private equity firm using, among other tools, the discipline of a man who understood that the quality of your decisions is directly proportional to the quality of your sleep. But the notification was from the house security system, specifically from the lower level, the guest wing basement that Celeste had renovated 18 months ago into what she called a wellness suite. Infrared sensor, motion triggered, Marcus looked at the notification, then at the ceiling, then at the space beside him in the bed, which was empty because Celeste was visiting her sister in Portland for the week, or so she had said when she left on Monday. He got up. The Aldridge house was what real estate listings, with their gift for understatement, described as a significant property. 12,000 square feet on 4 acres in the Westbrook Hills neighborhood, with a wine cellar, a gym, a home theater, and the lower-level guest wing that Celeste had added during the renovation she'd overseen while Marcus had been working through the Vantara acquisition. He'd barely seen the finished result. He'd been busy. He was always busy. Celeste had told him it was beautiful, and he'd agreed from photographs. He took the internal elevator to the lower level. The guest wing was at the end of a marble corridor, 2 rooms, a bathroom, a small sitting area. All empty as far as he knew. They hadn't had guests in months. The renovation had been sold to him as adding value to the property and giving Celeste a project to focus on while he was consumed by work. He walked down the corridor. At the end, past the 2 guest rooms, there was a door that Marcus had assumed, without ever specifically verifying, was a utility closet or mechanical room. It was steel reinforced with a keypad lock. He'd noticed it once, and Celeste had said something about it being for the home's network and security equipment. He'd accepted this. He accepted many things Celeste told him about the house without verification because the house was her domain, and he trusted her, and he was very, very busy. The motion sensor log on his phone showed the trigger had come from behind this door. Marcus stood in front of it. He pressed his ear to the steel. From inside, faint but unmistakable a sound, a human sound, specifically a voice. Specifically, a voice that sounded in its particular register, its specific pitch, the way it curved upward at the end of a word, the way certain voices do, when they're calling for attention in the dark, like a voice he had last heard speaking at Christmas dinner 14 months ago, 3 weeks before the car accident that had killed, according to the medical examiner's report and the coroner's certificate and the funeral he had attended, and the grave he had visited every month for over a year, his mother. "Hello," he pressed closer to the door. "Hello, is someone, Marcus?" It was barely a whisper, thin and dry and abraded down to almost nothing. But it was unmistakably the voice of Eleanor Aldridge, who had been buried in Westbrook Memorial Cemetery for 14 months, who he had eulogized in front of 200 people, who he had, oh God, who he had, Marcus, please. The voice cracked. Please. His code worked, of course it worked. It was his house, and the door swung open. The room was not a utility closet. It was a room. A real room, approximately 20 feet by 15, with a ventilation unit, a small bathroom through an interior door, a cot, a table, a lamp that was currently off because the lamp, he would discover later, was on a timer that Celeste controlled remotely. There were books, neatly stacked, a blanket, a space heater. These were not the accommodations of a dungeon, they were the accommodations of someone who had been housed here with the specific, terrible thoughtfulness of a person who intended the arrangement to last. Chained, an actual physical chain, attached to a ring bolt in the wall, and a cuff around the left ankle, was a woman. She was sitting on the cot with both hands wrapped around her knees, and she was thin. Significantly, visibly thin, in the way of someone who has been given sufficient calories to survive but not sufficient calories to maintain. Her silver hair, which Marcus's mother had worn short and precise, was grown out past her shoulders. Her face was his phone fell. He didn't notice. He crossed the room in 4 steps and went to his knees in front of her, and he looked at her face, his mother's face, except not quite, because there was something wrong, something his brain kept sliding off of a leaner, he said. The woman on the cot looked at him. "No," she said, her dry, abraded voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Edith. Edith Marsh." A breath. Eleanor was my twin sister. Marcus stared at her. Behind him, in the doorway, he heard a sound. He turned. His wife, Celeste, was standing in the doorway in her travel coat, her rolling suitcase still in her hand, still wearing her airport expression. She had not been in Portland. She had come home in the middle of the night, perhaps because of the same notification, perhaps for a reason that was becoming, in the cold lead light of this room, appallingly clear. She looked at the woman on the cot. She looked at Marcus on his knees on the floor. Her expression was not guilt. Not quite. It was the expression of someone looking at a situation they have managed for a long time that has just become unmanageable, and who is calculating, very rapidly, what to do about it. "Marcus," she said. "Let me explain. The police arrived at 4:15. Marcus had made the call immediately, not because he was certain of anything, not because he understood anything, but because there was a woman chained to a wall in his basement, and that superseded every other consideration, including his wife's voice saying, "Marcus, please, just listen. Let me explain this, please." He had listened to Celeste explain things for 11 years of marriage. He had been, by his own later admission, an exceptionally willing listener where Celeste was concerned. This was the first time he'd made a phone call before hearing the explanation. Detective Yolanda Pierce arrived with her partner and 3 uniformed officers. She was a compact woman in her mid-40s with the particular quality of someone who has been surprised before and long ago made peace with the possibility of further surprises. She assessed the room, the chain, the woman on the cot, and Celeste in the doorway with equal professional attention. She asked Marcus to wait in another room. She asked Celeste the same. She sat with the woman Edith Marsh and spoke to her in the low, measured voice of someone trained to make strangers feel safe. And Edith Marsh, who had apparently been waiting for this moment for a very long time, talked. Marcus sat in the kitchen with his hands flat on the marble counter and tried to make the architecture of the last 14 months make sense. His mother, Marcus Aldridge, had died in January of the previous year. Single vehicle accident on the highway at night. Car had caught fire. The body had been identified. He pushed past the memory of that identification, which he would never fully dislodge from the inside of his skull, and the funeral had followed, and the grief, and the specific, private devastation of a man who had a complicated relationship with his mother and had always imagined he'd have more time to work it out. And now, in his basement, for reasons that were not yet fully clear, there was a woman who shared his mother's face but not her name, a twin. His mother had never mentioned a twin. He thought about this, sitting at the marble counter in the silence of his kitchen at 4 in the morning, and the thought kept arriving and departing without sticking because the alternative thought kept displacing it. If Edith Marsh is here, where is Eleanor? Detective Pierce came to the kitchen at 5 a.m. She sat across from him. She had that quality of law enforcement professionals who have learned to deliver devastating information without it becoming performance matter-of-fact human, prepared for whatever response came. "Mr. Aldridge," she said, "I'm going to need you to tell me everything you know about your mother's death." Chapter 2. The confession. The gaslighting villain Celeste Aldridge had, by every external measure, a perfect life. This was not a coincidence. It was a project. She had understood from a young age, from a difficult, financially precarious, uncertain young age that Marcus knew nothing about because she had curated the version of her past that he received, that a perfect life required management. Constant, vigilant, occasionally ruthless management. She had married Marcus at 31. He was brilliant, generous, and consumed. Consumed by work, by ambition, by the specific hunger of a man who had been raised by a woman who told him daily that ordinary was a failure and that excellence was the only acceptable form of existence. Eleanor Aldridge had been, by every account Celeste had gathered over 11 years of close observation, a woman of extraordinary force of personality who had constructed her son as both her masterwork and her primary audience. She had done it with love. That was what made it so difficult to name. Eleanor had loved Marcus enormously, and she had expressed that love by being present in every corner of his life in a way that left very few corners for anyone else. Celeste sat in the interview room at the Westbrook Police Department and told Detective Pierce that she had loved Marcus from the beginning and wanted to protect him. She said this without apparent irony. "Mrs. Aldridge," Pierce said carefully, "you're telling me you chained a woman to a wall in your basement for 14 months. I'm telling you I made a terrible decision," Celeste said. Her voice was controlled, the voice of someone who has rehearsed this, at least partially. "I'm telling you the circumstances that led to it. I'm listening." Celeste folded her hands on the table. She had asked for an attorney. The attorney had arrived at 6 a.m. and had advised her to say nothing. She had chosen to say something anyway, which Pierce noted privately as the behavior of someone who has been waiting a long time to explain. Eleanor had a twin sister, Celeste said. Edith Marsh. They were estranged, had been since they were in their 20s. I found out about Edith 18 months ago when I was going through some of Eleanor's correspondence letters that had been in a box of Eleanor's things I was given after she moved most of her belongings to our guest room. A pause, the guest room in our main house. She had moved into our home, Detective. My home. For the 5th time in 4 years. Each time for a reason that was each time with the specific intention of stay with Edith, Pierce said. Celeste looked at her hands. I found the letters. Edith had been writing to Eleanor for 15 years. Eleanor had never responded. Edith had clearly been trying to reconcile. The letters were extraordinary. A woman writing to her sister for 15 years with no response. A pause. I found Edith. I went to meet her. I wanted to understand Eleanor better. I thought if I understood where she came from, I could understand. She stopped, started again. Edith was everything Eleanor wasn't. She was warm. She was open. She acknowledged freely that Eleanor had always been difficult, that their estrangement had been Eleanor's choice, and Edith had never fully understood why. She told me things about Eleanor's past that explained a great many things. "And then," Pierce said, "and then Eleanor died." Celeste's voice changed slightly. Not quite grief, something more complicated. "The accident, January. And I attended the funeral and I watched Marcus grieve, and I thought it was over. I thought we could finally, but in the will," Celeste said, and something hardened behind her eyes. "Eleanor left instructions. A trust. With conditions. One of the conditions was that Marcus had to consult with the trust's designated advisor, Eleanor's personal attorney, a man who had worked for Eleanor for 30 years, and who shared every one of her opinions about how Marcus should run his company and his life before making any major business decisions for a period of 10 years. She looked at Pierce directly. "My husband's mother from beyond the grave had arranged to keep managing him. For 10 years, Pierce said nothing. She was good at saying nothing. I found out about the trust 3 weeks after the funeral," Celeste continued. "I also found out from Edith, with whom I had stayed in contact, that Eleanor had not, in fact, died in that car accident. The room was very quiet. Edith told me," Celeste said. "She'd gotten a call. Final, shocking call from Eleanor after years of silence. Eleanor was going to disappear. She'd apparently become aware of a serious legal problem. I don't have all the details. I've since learned more, and she'd staged her own death and was planning to leave the country." Her jaw tightened. "The car that burned, the body that was identified, it was arranged. I don't know all the details of how. I know it was arranged. So Eleanor Aldridge staged her own death," Pierce said flatly. "Yes." Celeste pressed her lips together. "And I was the only person who knew. And I had to decide what to do with that. And what you decided," Pierce said in the same flat voice, "was to find Edith Marsh, who bore a physical resemblance to Eleanor, and chain her in your basement. I decided," Celeste said, "that Edith was the leverage that would keep Eleanor gone. If Eleanor knew her twin was, she started again. If Eleanor knew I had Edith, she wouldn't come back and disrupt Marcus's life and my marriage. It was containment. I told Edith I needed time to figure out what to do. I told her it was temporary. 14 months, Pierce said. Celeste looked at the table. "I know," she said. "Mrs. Aldridge. An innocent woman who had done nothing, who had been writing conciliatory letters to her sister for 15 years, who had been, by your own account, The opposite of the problem you were trying to manage spent 14 months chained in your basement. I know, because you wanted to control your mother-in-law. Because I wanted my husband to be free of his mother. Celeste looked up and her eyes were fierce, not contrite, fierce, which was its own terrible kind of sincerity. Everything I did because I wanted Marcus to have the life he deserved, without a leaner in every corner of it. Without I know it doesn't justify what I did to Edith. I know that. But I need you to understand what a leaner Aldridge was. Pierce looked at her for a long moment. We'll talk about a leaner Aldridge, she said. But first we're going to talk about everything you did to Edith Marsh. And we're going to talk about it very carefully and for a very long time. She had also told him on the night of his college graduation that she hoped he understood that everything she'd done for him constituted a debt, not a gift. He had been 22. He had dismissed it as a strange way of phrasing a moment of maternal pride. He had never revisited it. His attorney, Frank Delaney, put down his pen at hour 2 and said, "Marcus, what do you actually know about your mother's past? What do you mean her background, family, where she came from before she had you?" Marcus looked at the window. She grew up in Ohio, a small town. Her parents died when she was young. She put herself through college. Did she ever mention sibling? No. Friends from childhood. Connections to anyone from before she moved to this city? Marcus was quiet for a moment. No, he said. She didn't talk about the past. She said looking backward was wasteful. He paused. I always thought it was just her personality. Focusing on the present, Frank looked at him carefully. The police have, in the last 3 hours, been going through your wife's records and Edith Marsh's account of her history with a leaner. Some of what they're finding is significant. Tell me, Frank told him. Eleanor Aldridge, born Eleanor Marsh, one of 2 twin daughters of a family in rural Ohio, had left home at 19 under circumstances that Edith, in her statement to Detective Pierce, described as a sudden and complete disappearance. She'd told their parents she was going to college. She'd gone to college, and she had, systematically and deliberately, severed every connection to the life before it. The reason, according to Edith, was not cruelty. It was calculation. Eleanor had decided at 19 that the family she came from, limited, provincial, financially constrained, was not the family she intended to have. She had constructed an entirely new identity. Not fraudulently, exactly. She'd used her real name, attended real institutions, but selectively. She kept nothing from before. She'd told Marcus's father, and then Marcus, that she had no living family. She'd maintained this for 35 years. The legal problem Detective Pierce mentioned, Frank said, goes back further than the staged death. The police are still investigating, but it appears your mother had been for many years using a financial management structure that included some entities that weren't fully above scrutiny. Marcus looked at him. Are you telling me my mother had a legal problem that predated her death? I'm telling you the investigation is early. I'm telling you that the financial trust she left, the one with the 10-year management conditions, may have been structured in part to protect certain assets from scrutiny rather than purely to manage your business decisions. Frank paused. I want you to be prepared for the possibility that Eleanor Aldridge was not exactly who she presented herself to be, in several dimensions. Marcus sat with this. He had spent 11 years watching Celeste and his mother interact with the specific, exhausting attention of a man who loved both of them and was tired of being the median point between their opposing gravitational fields. He had watched Celeste's jaw tighten at Eleanor's presence and Eleanor's eyes narrow at Celeste's confidence, and he had managed and mediated and smoothed and redirected and told himself it was normal, it was family. All families had this. He had not asked either of them directly what was actually happening. He had not asked because asking would have required choosing, and choosing would have been disloyal to whichever one he hadn't chosen. He understood, sitting in Frank's office on Friday morning, that this was its own form of abdication. That the man who had built a $14 billion company by making clear-eyed, well-researched, non-sentimental decisions had somehow been constitutionally unable to apply any of those skills to the 2 women he was supposed to know best. He had managed Vantara. He had not managed his own house. And in the space created by his non-management, something extraordinary and terrible had grown. He went to see Edith Marsh that afternoon. She was at Westbrook General, dehydrated, malnourished, a stress fracture in her left ankle from the cuff, a respiratory infection from the basement's air quality. The doctors said she would recover fully. They said it with the careful optimism of people managing difficult news, which Marcus was experienced enough to read accurately. She was sitting up in the hospital bed when he came in. The silver hair, longer than Alina had worn hers. The same bone structure, the same particular set of the jaw, the same eyes, his mother's eyes, looking at him from a face that was his mother's face arranged by a different life. "Mr. Aldridge," she said. She did not seem afraid of him, which he respected and found, under the circumstances, more than he deserved. "Edith." He sat in the chair beside the bed. He had prepared things to say. None of them seemed adequate. "I want you to know that I had no knowledge." "I know," she said. "Your wife told me in the beginning that you didn't know." That was actually a pause. "It was the only thing that made it survivable, knowing that you weren't part of it." He looked at his hands. "I'm going to ensure you have everything you need. Medical care, legal support, whatever financial, Mr. Aldridge." Her voice was gentle. "I don't need you to write a check right now. I've been waiting 14 months to talk to someone from Alina's life." She looked at him directly. "I want to talk about my sister." Marcus looked at her. "She was my twin," Edith said. We were everything to each other until we were 19, and then something in her shifted and she left and never came back. I spent my whole adult life not understanding why." Her eyes were clear and sad. "I have a theory now, after everything your wife told the police, but I would like to know what Alina told you, about herself, what she said her life was." Marcus talked for an hour. He told Edith everything he knew about his mother, the version of Alina he'd been given. The self-made narrative, the deliberate isolation from the past, the force of will and the love that came attached to expectation. Edith listened. She nodded occasionally. She cried once quietly and then stopped. "She was afraid," Edith said when he finished. "She was always afraid. When we were children, fear made her brilliant. She worked harder than anyone I've ever known because she was terrified of staying still. But it also made her cruel to herself and eventually to everyone around her." She looked at the window. "She loved you, Mr. Aldridge. What you've described, that level of investment, even when it was damaging, that's love that doesn't know how to hold itself." She paused. "It doesn't excuse the harm, but it's real." Marcus said nothing for a moment. "Do you know where she is?" he asked. Edith shook her head. "When she called me the call before the staged death, she said she was going somewhere she couldn't be followed. She said she was sorry. It was the first time in 35 years I'd heard her voice." Her eyes were wet again. "She didn't say sorry to me specifically. She said it generally into the phone and hung up." A pause. "I think that was the most self-awareness she was capable of." Marcus looked at his mother's twin in a hospital bed and felt the specific ache of understanding something too late and too fully. "I'm sorry," he said, "for what was done to you. In my house. I'm sorry." Edith Marsh looked at him with his mother's eyes. "I know," she said. "I think you are." Chapter 4. What remains? The moral payoff. Walking into the light. Celeste Aldridge was charged on 6 counts. The primary charge was unlawful imprisonment. The secondary charges included conspiracy, obstruction for her role in concealing knowledge of Alina's staged death, and 2 additional counts that Marcus's attorney briefed him on in the careful language of someone aware that each word was landing on a person already at capacity. She was held without bail pending the arraignment, on the argument made successfully by the prosecution that someone who had maintained a secret imprisonment for 14 months with no disclosure had demonstrated a willingness to sustain deception over extended time that made flight risk assessment complicated. Marcus attended none of the hearings. He attended them through Frank, who attended in person and reported back. This was not avoidance, or not only avoidance. It was the decision of a man who was trying, for possibly the first time, to understand what he actually felt before performing a response to it. What he actually felt was enormous and difficult to organize. He felt grief for his mother, who was alive somewhere, and was also, apparently, a woman he had known less accurately than he'd believed. He felt grief for Alina as he had known her, who was a real person, even if the background of that person had been constructed and curated. The love had been real, even if the autobiography had been selective. He felt betrayal for Celeste, clean and simple and devastating in the way that betrayals by people you have loved for a long time always are. He kept replaying the specific texture of their marriage through the new filter of what he now knew, and certain moments, certain absences, certain late nights when Celeste had told him she was managing something in the house, certain conversations she'd redirected with a smoothness he'd taken for competence, rearranged themselves with horrible clarity. He felt underneath both of those, something that he was reluctant to name but that his therapist he had called a therapist on Friday, the first phone call of the morning before Frank, which was itself a notable fact identified as relief. Relief, he said, in the therapist's office on the first visit, trying the word out like an unfamiliar piece of equipment. "Tell me what you mean when you feel it," said Dr. Anita Shetty, who was direct and precise and did not require him to perform anything. "I mean," he stopped, tried again. "My mother is alive somewhere, that's not relief. But for 11 years every room I walked into that contained both my mother and my wife had a specific quality, like a room with too much furniture, like there was no clean space to move. And now," he stopped again. "The furniture is gone," Dr. Shetty said. "Yes, which is terrible, yes, and also," he looked at the window. "Quiet," he said. "It's very quiet, that quiet is real," Dr. Shetty said. "It doesn't mean you wanted any of this. It means you were living in a constrained space for a very long time. The investigation into Marcus Aldridge's financial history took 3 months. The results were, as Frank had warned they might be, complex. Marcus had, over the course of 20 years, used a series of trust vehicles and subsidiary entities to manage money in ways that had periodically skirted the edges of what was permissible. Nothing that rose to the level of criminal charges against her estate, but enough to explain why a woman facing increased regulatory scrutiny in the year before her death might have chosen to disappear rather than remain. The trust, the one with the 10-year management conditions, was dissolved by court order. The legal problem it had been designed partly to obscure was addressed, with penalties, by the estate. Marcus wrote a check. It was very large. He did not think about it more than was necessary. The search for Marcus herself produced, after 2 months, a result that Detective Pierce delivered personally. A woman matching Marcus's description had passed through customs in Portugal under a different name 14 months ago. The trail went cold after that. Interpol had been notified. There was no active pursuit because Marcus Aldridge had not been charged with a crime. Her staged death, while morally repugnant, had involved no fraud that the prosecutors could make stick without her presence to prosecute. She had simply disappeared. Marcus sat with this information for a week before doing anything with it. Then he wrote 2 letters. The first was to Marcus, sent to the last known address in Portugal, a long shot, likely futile. He told her he knew she was alive. He told her about Edith. He told her that Edith was recovering and had said she would like to hear from her sister if her sister was ever ready to be found. He told Marcus that he was not angry, or rather, that he was, and that it would take time, but that he was working on it with professional assistance, and that the door was open if she chose to come back. He told her he loved her. He told her he needed her to understand that love had limits, that the way she had expressed love had caused damage, and he would not be returning to that version of the relationship. That if she came back, things would be different. That he needed her to be willing to work for different. He sealed the letter and gave it to Frank to dispatch through the appropriate channels. The second letter was to Celeste. He sat with that one longer. He did not send it for 3 weeks, not because he didn't know what he wanted to say, but because he needed to be certain he was saying it from the right place. Not from the acute, burning shock of the early days. Not from the performed composure he sometimes used when he needed to sound more resolved than he felt. From somewhere real. He wrote it on a Tuesday morning, in the kitchen of the house that he had moved back into after the police completed their work, sitting at the marble counter with coffee and the particular early morning quiet that he was still getting used to. "Celeste, I have been trying to understand what you did. Not excuse it, understand it. I think I do understand it, at least partially, and I want to be honest with you about what that understanding contains." You were not wrong that my mother had a damaging presence in our marriage. You were not wrong that I failed, consistently, to address it. You were not wrong that the version of love she practiced came with costs that I deflected onto you rather than nomming honestly. Those are real things. What you did with that understanding was imprison an innocent woman who had no part in any of it. Edith Marsh wrote to her sister for 15 years hopping for reconciliation. She got 14 months on a cot in our basement. That is not something I can hold alongside what I felt for you. I've tried to find a place where both things fit. There isn't one. I will not be at the trial. I will provide through Frank whatever the court requires. I hope the process gives you the accountability that I think somewhere you also need. I loved you. I believe you loved me in the way you were able. I think we were both living in a house with no clean space to move, and we both made choices about how to respond to that. Mine were abdications. Yours were something worse. I hope, sincerely, that you find your way to something better than this. Marcus, he sealed it. He gave it to Frank. Then he sat in the quiet kitchen for a while longer. The foundation was Edith's idea. She had been recovering for 2 months fully ambulatory, weight restored, the respiratory infection gone, and she had come to the house for the first time to have lunch with Marcus. She had asked beforehand if she could see the room. He had let her. He had stood outside the corridor while she went in alone, and she had been in there for perhaps 10 minutes, and when she came out her face was clear and composed and she said only, "Thank you," and they had gone upstairs. Over lunch she had said, "I've been thinking about what to do with what happened." "What do you mean?" "I mean I have options," Edith said. "I can be a victim. I can be a story. I can be a settlement." She looked at him with his mother's eyes and her own equanimity. "Or I can be useful." She set down her fork. "There are systems in this country, legal, social, financial, that make it very easy for someone to be imprisoned in a private residence and nearly invisible to any authority that might help them. I know this because I experienced it for 14 months. She paused. "I would like to use what happened to make those systems harder to exploit." Marcus looked at her. "I have resources," he said. "I know you do." She looked at him steadily. "What I have is time and clarity and a very specific understanding of exactly how this kind of thing happens." A pause. "Between the two of us, we might make something useful." Marcus thought about his mother's voice. About an 11-year marriage and a $14 billion company and a 14-month imprisonment, and a letter on its way to Portugal that might arrive or might not. About all the rooms he'd walked into and walked out of without looking clearly at what they contained. "Yes," he said. "I think we could." The Marcus Aldridge Foundation for Domestic Safety and Legal Advocacy was incorporated in the spring. Edith served as executive director. Marcus provided the funding and the board connections and the particular competence he had always had for building operational structures that worked. Dr. Shetty connected them with a network of social workers, legal advocates, and law enforcement liaisons who had been trying, without sufficient resources, to address exactly the systemic gaps that had allowed Edith's imprisonment to go undetected. They hired 12 people in the first year. They opened 3 regional offices in the second. They partnered with 3 state legislatures on bills that updated private residence inspection protocols and cross-referenced law enforcement databases in ways that the Westbrook case had exposed as critically incomplete. Marcus did not step back from Aldridge Capital. He was, underneath everything, still the man who had built it, methodical, clear-eyed, allergic to waste. But he ran it differently. He hired a deputy CEO he actually trusted to manage the daily operations. He left the office at 6. He slept until 5:30. He had dinner with Edith on the second Tuesday of every month. He went to therapy on Thursdays. He did not date for a long time longer than people around him seemed to think was appropriate, which he found he did not care about, because he was engaged in the slow, necessary work of learning what he actually thought and felt and wanted when he wasn't managing someone else's presence in his life. It turned out there was a great deal to learn. It turned out he was, at 47, still capable of surprising himself. The letter to Portugal came back unopened in June. The address had been insufficient. He wrote another. Frank found a better address. He did not know if Alina would answer. He did not know if she was safe or settled or diminished or still the force of personality he had grown up orbiting. He did not know what a conversation with her would look like now, on what terms, with what rules, in what language built for two people who understood each other accurately rather than the language they'd used for 40 years, which had been fluent and incomplete. He kept the door open because closing it would have been the easier thing, and he was trying, at 47, to stop choosing the easier thing. On the last Thursday of October, Marcus drove to Westbrook Memorial Cemetery. He parked at the gate and walked the path he'd walked every month for 14 months before he'd learned the grave was empty, a monument to a fiction, a stone that marked nothing but his own willingness to accept what he was told. He stood in front of the stone. Eleanor Aldridge, beloved mother. The dates were wrong. The premise was wrong. The whole architecture of this particular grief was wrong. He stood there anyway, because the grief was real even if the grave wasn't. And because the woman the stone was supposed to represent had been real, complicated and controlling and frightened and fiercely loving, and she was, somewhere in the world, still real, and he had no address for that. He stood there for 20 minutes. Then he turned and walked back down the path toward the gate, past the other stones, in the October light that was doing something specific and amber with the afternoon, and he felt, not resolution, which was too clean a word, but the feeling of a man who has stopped standing still and started moving, who doesn't know exactly where the path leads but has, for the first time in a long time, committed to the direction. The gate was open. He walked through it. Please subscribe, like, share, turn on notifications so you never miss a story. The ENDNEXT.